Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the Call of Duty Black Ops 3 multiplayer beta. It went open for the last couple of days of its beta on PC, that's specifically what you're seeing here. And it's the first time we've had a Call of Duty beta since World at War. So, it's the first one in about 7 years as far as the Call of Duty franchise goes. At least I believe that World at War came out in 2008. I'm pretty sure it did. Anyway, suffice to say, this is a pretty big deal. But as we all know with Call of Duty, the beta is not really so much about balancing tweaks or fixing bugs or anything like that. It's really more just a demo of the multiplayer for the inevitable release. And so I guess we'll go ahead and get right into it. You may be wondering how this thing performs on PC. Now you gotta keep in mind that I do have a pretty beefy rig. I've got an i7 4790K, I've got 16 gigs of RAM, and I've got a GTX 970. That said, running at 720p, the thing was running right around 200 frames a second, and it would drop down to about 150 to 130, maybe, at the most intense parts. And that's with everything maxed out, so most likely if you've got a beefy enough rig, you shouldn't have any trouble running this thing. I do know that some people had some performance issues on middle and lower end systems. It's also worth noting we don't have a driver update for this thing yet, and not all of the optimizations have been made yet as well. That said, it does run pretty well. I was very pleasantly surprised with it. The only real issue that I ran into is that there was a lot of what seems to be micro stuttering, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's something related to the game code or something related to drivers or what, but this is something that I noticed with Black Ops 1 as well, actually, when it first started out, so that's worth noting. Although Black Ops 1 had tons of other issues when it came out. This is very, very playable. So most likely not going to be an issue when it gets to launch. If they somehow have a catastrophic build, that would be very surprising to me. As far as its presentation, though, it's really not impressive. It's about average for the current gen of consoles, the Xbox One and PS4, which is to say that it doesn't look bad. It's got some decent texture work, it's got some pretty solid modeling, the animations are generally pretty smooth and fluid, and it all works together pretty well. They do have some decent particle effects, although I would say that the explosions could look a bit better, but that's just me. And a lot of people act like this thing looks terrible. It really doesn't. I don't know where they're getting that idea. I guess they're just too used to PC exclusive games that are deliberately going for the extremely high end of visuals, like, say, Star Citizen. So really, I don't care so much about visuals as long as they look fine and the game itself runs fine, and that's exactly what happens here. The art style is futuristic. I believe it's set in the 2050s or something like that, and it ultimately ends up looking kind of ridiculous sometimes. I mean, some of the weapon designs look outright terrible, but others look pretty good. I mean, you've got a futuristic P90 style thing that looks very nice, and a few other weapons that go on the sort of practical but also futuristic side, and that's generally where things are going to look good in games like this, when you can look at the thing and go, yeah, I can believe that. And then there's other weapons that you look at and you go, no, can't believe it. But really, that's more of an aesthetic thing, and that's entirely up to the player. As far as the sound design goes, generally the voice acting's pretty good. Obviously, we've just got battle chatter and not much else, so they've done a pretty good job with all of that. It sounds like Steve Bloom doing the voiceover work for the CDP faction as far as their announcer goes, so that amuses me, because he's trying to put on a sort of Hispanic accent, and it sounds hilarious. At least it sounds like Steve Bloom, so if it isn't, I'd be surprised. That said, they did generally do a pretty good job, and it works fairly well for the game. So we'll have to wait and see how it goes in the single-player portion of the game, because that's where the meat of the voice acting is going to be. But the battle chatter works fine, and it really always has in a Call of Duty game. And as far as sound effects go, some of them are fairly good, and others not so much. Now, Call of Duty in more recent times has had just this issue of the sound effects not really being punchy enough. That does carry over to some degree here. Some of the weapons do sound fairly pathetic, but others sound pretty beefy, and they have a decent balance of the two. So at least it's not as bad as some of the other ones. It's certainly not as bad as, say, Call of Duty Ghosts, from what I've heard of that stuff. So there's that, but it's not particularly impressive sound design either. It's just fairly standard stuff. So they've got some pretty decent presentation, but it's nothing particularly amazing. Then we come to what really matters here. Now, this is the multiplayer beta, so it's entirely going to be multiplayer related stuff, obviously. They do not have zombies mode available. There are no hardcore modes available either, which is a bit to my chagrin, because I much prefer hardcore modes in Call of Duty games. That said, a lot of this is going to be very, very familiar to you if you've played another Call of Duty game, since Call of Duty 4 anyway. And it's going to be more reminiscent of a mixture of Black Ops 2 and Advanced Warfare. Now, there is a problem with that, and I will get to that in a moment. But if you haven't played Advanced Warfare, that actually shook the series up quite a bit. It was still definitely Call of Duty, but that was mostly in the gunplay aspects, and the actual movement system felt pretty radically different in a lot of ways, just because you had that very quick boosting stuff you would do that was more reminiscent of something like Unreal Tournament than Call of Duty. Unfortunately, the maps in that game were absolutely atrocious, so it actually was a huge detriment to the game that you had that movement system. They did away with that in Black Ops 3. Instead, what they did was they introduced a movement system a lot more reminiscent of Titanfall. But I'll go over this in a moment. Let's first talk about the biggest change that they had to the Call of Duty formula, which is that while you still have create a class and you can build a class of weapons, perks, equipment, that sort of thing, basically as you wish, using the Pick 10 system, they also added in something called a specialist system. Now, there are a bunch of different characters that you can select in the multiplayer, and each of them have one of two abilities. The first of them is basically a special weapon of some description, pretty much a super weapon, really. The second one is a special ability. Now, these abilities charge up over time, just gradually as you're playing the game. Getting higher and higher scores makes it charge up faster. And once you finally get that meter to charge up, it's kept track at the bottom right of the screen, it allows you to select the weapon and use it. Now, this can sort of be tailored to your play style, but there is something you will notice very, very quickly as you're playing this game. And that is that people generally don't use the special abilities, even though they may actually sound fantastic. Outrider is the character that I play the most. She is the one who has the option of either the Sparrow or the Vision Pulse. Vision Pulse allows you to see enemies through walls and such like that, for a limited amount of time anyway. And it allows you to see them moving around and everything. So that's actually a very useful ability, right? Well, its range is pretty limited, and it only lasts a few seconds. And then her other ability, her special weapon, is a bow that shoots arrows that explode. To continue with this trend, there's the character of Ruin, who also is one of the ones you can unlock extremely early in the game. And he has either gravity spikes, where he basically leaps up and then just jams these two things into the ground and sends out a shockwave that instantly kills anybody within the shockwave. Or he can use the special ability, which makes him run faster for a short period of time. And then there's Battery, who gets the War Machine, which is a grenade launcher that launches grenades that will actually split into 3 grenades. Or She has kinetic armor, which is basically useless because it doesn't really absorb all that much damage, doesn't last very long, and it is basically useless if somebody gets a headshot on you. Are you noticing a trend here? If not, let me spell it out for you. There is basically no reason whatsoever to use the special abilities. These special weapons are just so much more powerful than the special abilities that you get. And these special weapons, almost all of them are a one-shot kill. I mean, the Sparrow that Outrider gets, if you directly hit an enemy with a bow shot with that, it instantly kills them, on top of blowing them up. And if you don't get an instant kill by just hitting them, well, chances are you'll do explosive damage to them, so it'll only take 1 or 2 shots to bring them down. And then there's another character who has the weapon the Tempest, which is basically a lightning gun that instantly kills whoever you hit with it, but then that lightning will also arc over to nearby enemies and instantly kill them too. These weapons are insanely powerful. Except for Seraph's Annihilator, oddly enough. That's the one thing that sounds the coolest. It's a revolver that instantly kills whoever it hits, and it basically will go straight through a lot of surfaces too. But you have to hit things with it. And chances are you're just going to get mowed down before you can actually sight in a target and actually hit it. I have not seen really anyone do well as Seraph. And so basically nobody plays Seraph, except just to mess around with it. Instead, nearly everyone either plays Outrider, Battery, Ruin, or the guy with the Tempest. And that's it. So pretty much all the other abilities just fall by the wayside. And it ends up being a complete waste, really. Which is kind of sad because, well, some of those other abilities would be pretty good if they were buffed up to actually be preferable alternatives to the super weapons. But the super weapons are insanely powerful, so there's no reason not to pick them. It's also worth noting that there is an abundance of things that will just completely shred you in this thing. Not only are the special weapons that the various specialists get in there, but a lot of the kill streaks are ridiculously overpowered right now. Like the Talon, for example. It's a small flying drone that will be able to fly up and just machine gun you to death. You can barely see the thing, you can barely hit it, it takes a lot of shots to bring down, and it just completely shreds you. There's another one called the Cerberus, which is basically a ground tank drone kind of thing that just rolls around and completely annihilates the enemy team basically no matter what, because it's also extremely hard to bring down, and you will just get mowed down incredibly quickly by it. There's also the thing that basically replaces the attack dogs, which is Wraps, and it spawns these balls that roll around on the ground, and when they run up to somebody they explode, which means that they can take out multiple enemies with a single one of these things, and it spawns a ton of them. So right off the bat you're seeing all these streaks that are just ridiculously powerful, and they tend to pop up quite a lot because people use care package a lot. And even though a lot of these are very high score streaks, they are just surprisingly easy for these people to get. And then there are other things that sound powerful, like Rolling Thunder, which has never actually been good in any of the Call of Duty games it's ever been in. And it just boggles the mind why you wouldn't use things like the Cerberus, or the Talon, or the Hellstorm missile. Seriously, why wouldn't you use the Hellstorm missile? I managed to get a 5-kill feed with that once. And I've never managed to do that in any Call of Duty game I've ever played. I've played all of them, except for Call of Duty 3 and Ghosts. Those are the only two I have not played yet. And I still have never gotten a 5-kill feed from any of these games. Until now, because the Hellstorm missile is insanely powerful. Now, whether or not that's a bad thing depends entirely on whether you're on the receiving end of it or not. Because if you're on the receiving end of it, it's going to piss you off. Just guaranteed. And if you're not on the receiving end of it, then you're not really bothered by it, or you're just amused by it. And once again, we run into this problem of Call of Duty rewarding people who just get lucky, rewarding people who just spray and pray, who cheap the game out and things like that, by giving them all these really powerful things and acting like it's a good thing, which it isn't really, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. They just need to tweak these score streaks to not be quite as absurdly powerful as they are. Don't get me wrong, it's fine if they're powerful, I understand, they're score streaks, they're supposed to be powerful, but in their current state, it's pretty much a situation where just about anybody can pretty much wipe out the enemy team in one fell swoop, and thus you win. And there's only so much you can do to actually fight against that. So it ends up being pretty problematic in this game in particular because, once again, those things are insanely powerful. And not only that, but you also have these specialist weapons that are thrown into the mix to add even more one-hit kill stuff in there. Because that's totally what Call of Duty needed more of. More cheap crap. As if it wasn't already bad enough that they basically kept the SVU from Black Ops 2, only they called it the Draken, and they made this pump-action shotgun absurdly powerful at a pretty long range, so it's basically just a, oh, you got spotted by a guy who has the pump-action shotgun, you're dead. Just, you're dead. Doesn't matter what you got, you're dead. And things like that are just really irritating. Although sniper rifles themselves are fairly difficult to use because they don't have the benefit of a quick scope in, and you can't really quick scope anymore. So there is that, but it's not quite as strong as the original Black Ops. So you can still sort of do it. It's just not quite the same as it was in other Call of Duty games, where some of the quick scoping got completely and utterly ridiculous, like in, for example, Modern Warfare 2, or to even some degree Black Ops 2. But honestly, the maps are really too small to really warrant sniper rifle usage anyway. This game is really dominated by the pump-action shotgun, SMGs, and assault rifles, which is pretty much how the previous Black Ops game was actually, so that's really nothing new. And assault rifles have pretty much always dominated the Call of Duty scene, so there is that. But they actually feel even weaker in this one than they usually do. And more often than not, I find people just using SMGs because they don't really impede your movement. Which at last brings me to the changes that they made to the movement system from Advanced Warfare, as well as the accusation that it's basically Titanfall. Alright, I played Titanfall. I actually really liked Titanfall. This is not Titanfall. What it is a hollow facsimile of Titanfall. You see, they added in the ability to have sort of a thrust jump, where you can jump, and then if you hit the jump button again, you can either hold it down for an extended burst on a jetpack, or you can just kind of repeatedly tap it to keep yourself in the air longer. On top of this, they added the ability to wall run, which both of these really sound reminiscent of Titanfall, right? Because you had a jetpack in Titanfall, as well as the ability to wall run. The difference is that Titanfall had its maps specifically designed for this. And on top of these maps being specifically designed for this, it had a momentum system, where if you were running on walls and using your jetpack and things like that, you could build up a really high degree of speed. Not quite the same as something like, say, Tribes, but not too horribly far off from something like that. And the gameplay in Titanfall ended up being incredibly fast-paced. This one doesn't really do that. In fact, if anything, you lose momentum when you start doing the wall running and things like that. So it feels like they just saw what Titanfall did and said, let's do that. And they didn't really put enough effort into it. They didn't really build the game around this movement system, because there are just so many blatantly obvious spots on these maps, at least the ones in the beta. I don't know how it'll be in the full game, but in the beta maps, it is so incredibly painfully obvious where you are supposed to wall run. And it's basically just a, well, here's the optional place you can wall run. It's not really what we designed the game around, but you can do it. And I mean, you can change direction by jumping off of the wall and then jumping back onto it, because you kind of stick to the wall. Or you can jump to other walls and continue wall running and things like that. But it just doesn't feel as smooth and fluid as Titanfall. It feels like they're just emulating that and not doing it as well. So what you're left with is basically Call of Titanfall MOBA edition. At least the specialist system just kind of screams MOBA. It's not quite MOBA. I mean, the map design is definitely 3-lane, at least in most regards, and they have these various characters who each have their own special abilities, although in this you only get one special ability instead of a bunch. So instead of doing what Advanced Warfare did, which was try something pretty radically different for Call of Duty, this feels very iterative. And not only does it feel iterative, it really is a regression. There's actually basically no customization in this thing. Now, it is worth noting that this is the beta, and some things are basically blocked off to us. Like, we can't do the paint shop thing, where you can customize your gun's paint jobs instead of just applying a stock camo to it. You can actually add some various graphics, different colors, all sorts of things like that. So that's kinda cool. And of course you do get the ability to mess around with your player card and your emblem, although the emblem thing has just been a pretty standard feature of Treyarch games since the original Black Ops, so it's not really anything new. But that's kind of it. I mean, you can't customize the appearance of any of the specialists, and that's something that was actually really cool about Advanced Warfare, and I believe Ghosts did it as well. So, if anything, this is basically a one step forward, two steps back kind of thing, where it's like, well, people didn't really receive Advanced Warfare all that well. Let's bring it back a bit and throw in these other elements to kind of spice things up. But what you really end up with is a game that can really only be described as clusterfuck. I mean, that's the only word that really comes to mind when I'm playing this thing. It's just a complete mess when you're actually playing it. Just complete and utter chaos most of the time. And it never really got fun while I was playing the beta. If anything, it only pissed me off. I mean, there is the possibility that they'll sort these things out by the time the game finally launches, but I really don't think that it's going to be able to salvage it. I mean, they've basically built the entire game around these specialists who really only have one worthwhile ability, which is to have this super weapon that insta-gibs things. And it's just not fun to play. Maybe the single player will be good, and I really do hope it's good, because I haven't been able to play the single player of the last few Call of Duty games, because the only experience I managed to get from Black Ops 2 and Advanced Warfare was of the multiplayer from Steam free weekends, at least so far. I do plan on picking them up eventually, but I can't help but get the feeling that this thing is just going to be dead within a couple of months, at least on PC. Maybe not on console, but on PC, it feels like it's going to be dead within a couple months, even though this thing does run on dedicated servers, and it does have a fairly solid PC version for the most part. And I know a lot of people will bring up the zombies mode too, but obviously that wasn't in the beta, and I have never liked zombies in any of the Call of Duty games. I just don't like zombies in general. They bore the hell out of me. And so that's not going to be able to save this thing. Hopefully they will sort out some of the issues by the time the game finally launches. And hopefully the single player will be good. But we'll just have to wait and see on this thing. But my first impressions from this beta are not really all that encouraging. It reminds me a lot of Advanced Warfare in the sense of it just being complete and utter chaos with regards to the actual gameplay. That said, the maps themselves are much better designed than anything Advanced Warfare had. But that's not really saying much. Like I said, the maps in Advanced Warfare were downright atrocious, and they did not build to the strengths of the movement system and the actual gameplay mechanics. This one does it a bit better, but they really did not optimize these maps for this new traversal system, and it shows. And they didn't build the game around these new mechanics. They just end up feeling like a complete gimmick that they have just torn from other games to be like, see guys, we can do that too. Who knows how this thing will ultimately turn out, but like I said, first impressions from the beta really aren't all that encouraging. I'll catch you guys in later videos.